I wasn't even on duty when it happened. That's what irked me the most. It was a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight just starting to warm the fields, birds chirping from the oaks that lined the edge of my 12-acre ranch. Coffee in hand, I was sitting on the back porch, boots kicked up, enjoying what little peace a man in my job ever gets. I'm Police Chief Dan Reynolds, 30 years in law enforcement, 22 of them in this very town. I've been shot at, sued, saluted, and screamed at. But never, not once have I been locked out of my own damn property. Until that Sunday. I heard it before I saw it, a hard metallic clunk that echoed up the gravel drive. My ranch sits on a sloped hill with a long driveway stretching from the gate to the house. I couldn't quite see who was down there, but I saw the flash of a safety vest and the outline of a pickup parked outside the entrance. Then silence. The gate, my gate, was closed. Not just closed, sealed. A thick industrial-grade chain now ran through the bars, padlocked tight. I stood up slowly, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. I set the mug down. The dogs barked and followed me as I walked toward the driveway. By the time I got close enough, the truck was already turning around at the cul-de-sac, pulling away like it had finished its business. It had. A bright orange tag was zip-tied to my gate. I tore it off. Notice of Access Suspension, Silver Creek Estates, HOA. I blinked. Once. Twice. I knew about the HOA. Barely. When Clara and I bought the property 3 years ago, we were told it fell under the outer border of Silver Creek's planned development area. I'd laughed it off. Let him try and control a working ranch, I'd said. Turns out, they tried. Apparently, I had violated HOA regulation number 7.41. Inappropriate land use adjacent to common areas. Translation: they didn't like my livestock fence running close to the trailhead that cut across the back corner of my property, land I legally owned. There was no warning, no letter. Just this chain and a padlock thrown over a gate I paid for on land I patrolled in a town I protected. I don't carry a badge on Sundays, but I carry my phone, and that's all I needed. 10 minutes later, I was on the line with a man named Ronald Spears, the acting president of the Silver Creek Estates HOA. His voice was calm, smug even. "Chief Reynolds," he said with an odd air of superiority, "this isn't personal. We're just enforcing community standards." "Ron," I replied, keeping my voice level, "you do realize locking someone out of their private property without legal authority is called unlawful detainment, right?" He chuckled. "Oh, come now, Dan. You know how these things work. It's a civil matter." I took a long breath. "No, Ron. When someone interferes with ingress and egress on private property with malicious intent, that can easily become criminal. And you just did that to the chief of police." Silence. "Wait, you're that Dan Reynolds?" he asked, suddenly unsure. "I am." There was a long pause. Then, "Well, I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding. Let me call the contractor. We'll have the gate unchained first thing Monday." "Ron," I said, "you've got until 4 p.m. today." I hung up. I wasn't angry. Yet. I was calculating. Because if this was happening to me, it was probably happening to others. This was no longer about a fence or a chain. It was about control. And the thing about power is, when you abuse it in front of the wrong person, you just might find yourself on the other side of the law. I spent most of that Sunday pacing the length of my front gate, phone in one hand, notepad in the other. Old habits die hard. Years in law enforcement have taught me, document everything. Every call, every timestamp, every photo. This wasn't just about a padlock anymore. This was about process, and how blatantly it had been ignored. The sun was high by then, and my patience was low. By noon, I'd reviewed the deed to the ranch, the plat map, and the boundary agreements we'd signed when Clara and I bought the property. Everything was clear. My land, my gate. The HOA had no right, none whatsoever, to touch a single inch of it. Yet here we were. Worse still, they never even gave me the courtesy of a notice. Not a letter, not an email, not even a passive-aggressive flyer stuck in the mailbox like they were famous for. Just a chain and a sign, as if I were trespassing on my own land. And if that wasn't enough, the galling part came at 1:43 p.m., when Clara got a message from one of the neighbors. "Hey, Clara, saw the HOA sealed your gate. Didn't know livestock fencing wasn't allowed back there. Hope y'all are okay." That's when the other shoe dropped. It wasn't just about a zoning dispute. This was a public move, a message, a quiet little power play from a group of clipboard warriors who had no idea they were tangling with someone who knew municipal code better than they did, someone who enforced it for a living. I walked down to the gate again, this time with bolt cutters in hand. I didn't plan to use them yet. I'm not a hothead, but I wanted them there. Just a reminder to myself. I had options. At 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Chief Reynolds," the voice said. "Speaking. This is Tiffany Carlisle. I'm the HOA secretary." "All right, Tiffany. What can I do for you?" "Well, we received your message," she said carefully, "and I wanted to extend our apologies. The board wasn't fully aware of the enforcement procedure used today. We understand there's been some tension." "Tension," I echoed dryly. "We'll be reviewing everything at our emergency board meeting tomorrow. The chain will be removed first thing." "Tomorrow's too late, Tiffany. You don't get to lock someone out of their property and then schedule a meeting at your convenience. You've got until 4 p.m. today." "Understood," she said, her tone wilting a bit. By 3:55 p.m., a dusty gray landscaping truck pulled up to the gate. A young guy with a ball cap and a nervous look stepped out and began cutting the lock. He didn't say a word, just nodded at me and tossed the chain in the back of his truck before driving off. No apology, no explanation. Clara stood beside me, arms crossed. "They really think they can just do things like this and walk away," she said. "They've been doing it to the folks in the subdivision for years," I replied, "but this time they did it to the wrong address." That night, I didn't sleep well, not because I was angry, but because I started thinking about what would have happened if I weren't the police chief. If this had happened to a single mother, a retired veteran, someone who didn't have the connections or the confidence to push back. I looked out the window at the gate, now unchained but still marked by the bright orange tag that had fluttered in the wind, like a warning flag. It was still there, and so was the insult it carried. This wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was going to be official. The morning after the gate incident, I arrived at the ranch earlier than usual. The sun was just peeking over the hills, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges. I took a deep breath, feeling that familiar mix of calm and resolve that always comes before a long day of work, and today, a long day of confrontation. Because make no mistake, this was no longer about a gate or a fence. This was about authority, about respect, about the boundaries between civilian life and official duty. And as the police chief, those lines aren't blurry. They're well defined. I walked through the house quickly, grabbing my badge and service weapon from the small safe in my office. Not because I expected a fight, but because I never went anywhere without them. Being chief means always being prepared. I called Clara to give her a quick update. She was calm but worried. "Dan," she said, "just be careful. This isn't just some neighborhood dispute. You're poking a hornet's nest." "I know," I said, "but someone's got to stand up." By 8 a.m., I was at City Hall for the morning briefing. The deputies filed in, coffee cups in hand, and I ran through the usual updates: traffic issues, petty theft, a couple of noise complaints. But my mind was only half there. Today, my priority was Silver Creek Estates. After the meeting, I met with the city attorney and my lieutenant to discuss the legal implications of what the HOA had done. It was clear. The HOA had no right to block my gate without due process. It wasn't just bad manners, it was illegal. Unauthorized obstruction of private property is a criminal offense in our jurisdiction, punishable by fines or even jail time. But this wasn't about prosecuting neighbors. This was about making sure the community knew where the law stood. Back at the ranch by 10 a.m., I met with my deputy, Officer Martinez. She was new but sharp, and I wanted her to see how complicated law enforcement could get when property rights, civic organizations, and personal interests collided. "We're going to file a formal complaint," I told her. "But more than that, I want you to understand that sometimes the law isn't just about arresting bad guys. It's about protecting rights, even when those rights aren't popular." She nodded, eyes wide. "So you're saying this is about setting a precedent?" "Exactly." I then drafted a letter addressed to the Silver Creek Estates HOA board. It was firm but professional. No threats, no name-calling. I outlined the violations, referenced the legal statutes, and requested immediate removal of all barriers and future communications before any such action. I sent the letter via certified mail and email, and I made a public notice for the town website. Everyone needed to know what was going on. That afternoon, the HOA president called me back. This time, his tone was less cocky, more cautious. "Chief Reynolds, I didn't realize you were actually the police chief when we locked the gate," Ronald Spears admitted. "That's the problem," I replied. "You don't get to act like a law unto yourselves just because you manage some neighborhood covenants." "I understand that now," he said. "We'll cooperate." That was a start, but I knew better than to trust empty promises. Later that day, Clara and I walked the property line, discussing the coming HOA meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. She was concerned, but she was also proud. "You're doing the right thing," she said, "not just for you, but for everyone out here." And I felt it too. Because being chief wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about standing up for what was right, even if that meant standing against the people who thought they could bend the rules. That gate might have been sealed once, but the law was open and clear, and I intended to keep it that way. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp, held in the community center just a few miles from my ranch. I'd never been to one of their meetings before, but tonight I was going to make sure it wasn't forgotten. When I arrived, the room was already buzzing with homeowners. Many faces I recognized, some wary, others curious. It was clear the gate incident had stirred the neighborhood more than I expected. The Silver Creek Estates HOA board members sat at a long table at the front, the center of attention. Ronald Spears, the president, sat in the middle. He was a man in his late 50s, dressed impeccably in a pressed blazer and polished loafers, carrying an air of entitlement. You could tell this was his turf, and he ruled it like a small kingdom. "Good evening," Ronald began, his voice smooth but with a slight edge. "We're here tonight to discuss recent community concerns regarding property boundaries and enforcement of HOA rules." The first few comments were typical, complaints about landscaping, noise, parking. Then the conversation shifted quickly to the gate. "You folks have to understand," Ronald said, gesturing toward me. "The HOA acts in the best interest of the community. We're trying to preserve property values and maintain safety." I stood, catching the room's attention. "Preserving property values doesn't mean you get to violate someone's rights," I said, calmly but firmly. especially when that someone is the chief of police for this town and the legal owner of the property in question. Ronald's eyes narrowed slightly, but he masked it with a polite smile. "I'm not here to argue over your position," he said, "but the HOA has rules that everyone agrees to when they move in. You can't just ignore them." I shook my head. No one agreed to rules that violate the law, and no one has the authority to lock a gate on private property without notice or due process. There was a murmur in the crowd. Some people looked like they sided with me. Others seemed uncomfortable. Ronald leaned forward, lowering his voice so only the board could hear. "You don't get to come in here and lecture us on the law, Chief. We've managed this community for years without interference." "I'm not here to lecture," I said. "I'm here to enforce the law. If you want to manage your community, do it within legal boundaries." That's when the true nature of the man in front of me revealed itself. "I'm the president of this HOA," Ronald said, voice rising, "and I decide what happens here." "No, Ronald," I replied evenly. "You're a private citizen. You don't get to act like a king. The law applies to everyone, even HOA presidents." There was a long silence. The board looked uncomfortable. Some homeowners shifted in their seats. Ronald cleared his throat and said, "Let's try to keep this civil." I nodded. "Fair enough." The meeting went on for another hour, with heated discussions and questions about what this meant for the future of the neighborhood. But one thing was clear. Ronald Spears had underestimated who he was dealing with. As I left the community center, a few neighbors approached me. "Thanks for standing up for us," said Mrs. Jenkins, a widow who lived 2 houses down. "We've been scared to speak up." "You're not alone," I told her. "The law is on your side." That night I realized this wasn't just a battle about fences or gates. It was about accountability and about making sure no one, no matter how powerful, thought they were above the law. Ronald Spears thought he was king. I was about to remind him who really ruled these parts. The day after the HOA meeting, I was back at the ranch, trying to catch up on paperwork, but my mind was elsewhere. The tension from the night before still hung heavy, and I knew this was far from over. Ronald Spears wasn't the kind of man who'd just back down gracefully. I reached for my phone and scrolled through contacts. One name kept standing out: Sheriff Bill Lawson, my old friend and ally from the county. We'd worked countless cases together over the years, and when things got complicated, Bill was the guy you called. I dialed his number, letting it ring twice before he picked up. "Dan, long time no hear. What's going on?" I explained the situation briefly, trying to keep my voice steady but serious. "The HOA sealed off my gate. No warning, no notice. They think they can push me around just because I'm a rancher. They don't know I'm the chief of police." There was a pause on the other end. "Wow," Bill said. "That's bold. HOA board members don't usually cross law enforcement like that. Tell me about it. I want to make sure we handle this right. I don't want to escalate unnecessarily, but I need to send a clear message." Bill laughed. "You've always been good at that. What do you need?" "I want you to swing by tomorrow with your deputies, just to show a presence. No arrests planned, no raid or anything. Just presence. You know, let them see the real law." He agreed immediately. "I've got your back, Dan. Consider it done." The next morning, as promised, a convoy of county sheriff vehicles rolled slowly through the neighborhood. Word spread fast. Within an hour, I was getting calls from HOA members and neighbors, some relieved, others outright scared. Clara watched it all from the porch, shaking her head. "You really think they'll listen now?" "I hope so," I said, "but we'll see." At noon, Ronald Spears called me, voice noticeably less confident. "Chief Reynolds, what exactly is going on?" I hear there are sheriff vehicles around. This is getting out of hand. Ronald, you locked a gate. I'm making sure it doesn't happen again. He sighed heavily. Look, we're willing to talk. Maybe we can come to an agreement. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Good, that's all I want. The rest of the day was spent meeting with HOA board members, county deputies, and a few community leaders. I laid out the legal ramifications of their actions clearly, emphasizing that the law applies to everyone equally, no exceptions. By the evening, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The HOA members, especially Ronald, seemed to realize this wasn't just a small fight anymore. Clara and I sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "This could have gone sideways," she said quietly. "Yeah," I replied, "but sometimes you have to remind people who holds the real power. Power backed by law and fairness." I smiled. "Exactly." That night, I drafted a public statement to the town, explaining the situation and reassuring residents that their rights were protected. It was important they knew this wasn't just about me. It was about standing up for everyone. The HOA may have sealed my gate, but now the real authority was on display. And they weren't going anywhere. The atmosphere at Silver Creek Estates had shifted dramatically since the sheriff's convoy rolled through the neighborhood. What was once a place where the HOA board ran with unchecked authority now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. I got the call early Tuesday morning, a terse message from the HOA secretary, Tiffany Carlisle. "Chief Reynolds, the board has called an emergency meeting tonight at 6 p.m. at the community center. They'd like to discuss the recent events and hopefully come to a resolution." I glanced over at Clara, who was making breakfast. "Looks like they're finally ready to talk," I said. "About time," she replied, flipping a pancake. "Or maybe they just want to save face." I couldn't argue with that. When I arrived that evening, the room was packed tighter than the last meeting. The tension was palpable. I scanned the crowd and noticed many residents who looked concerned but hopeful. Some faces were familiar, others new, but everyone was there because this had become more than just an HOA issue. It was a community matter. Ronald Spears was already seated at the head of the board table, but his posture was different. He seemed less like a king and more like a man who had been cornered. Tiffany addressed the crowd first. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. The board understands there have been misunderstandings and concerns. Tonight, we want to find a path forward." I stood and spoke next. "Thank you, Tiffany. I appreciate the HOA's willingness to meet. But let's be clear. Locking the gate without proper notice was not only illegal, it was disrespectful to the property owner and the community." There was a murmur of agreement. Ronald finally spoke, his voice measured. "Chief Reynolds, I want to apologize for the way things were handled. We acted hastily and without proper consultation. The board has agreed to review and revise our enforcement policies to ensure this never happens again." The room sighed collectively, some relieved, others skeptical. I nodded. "That's a good start, Ronald, but it's going to take more than promises. I want a formal written agreement that the HOA will not take enforcement actions on private property without due process, notification, and coordination with local authorities." He hesitated, but eventually agreed. Several homeowners raised questions about their own experiences, complaints about fines, barriers, and threats. I assured them that I would personally oversee any investigations into those claims. By the end of the meeting, the tone had shifted from confrontation to collaboration. The HOA board, perhaps chastened by the presence of law enforcement and the growing community voice, seemed ready to cooperate. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, Clara caught my eye. "They're not off the hook yet," she said. "No," I replied, "but tonight was the first step toward real accountability." The gate at my ranch was unlocked again, but the bigger barrier, the one between authority and community trust, was only just beginning to come down, and I was determined to make sure it stayed open. The emergency meeting was a milestone, but the fight wasn't over. If anything, it had revealed just how deep the HOA's power games ran, and how many homeowners felt trapped beneath their rule. Over the next week, I started digging into the HOA's enforcement records. The documents I got access to painted a troubling picture. There were dozens of notices sent to residents, fines for everything from grass height to paint colors to improper use of private property, and almost none of these had followed the correct legal procedures. Ronald and his board weren't just overstepping on my property. They were overstepping on nearly everyone's. I met with city planners and legal experts to review the HOA's rules and how they aligned, or didn't, with local ordinances. It turned out the HOA had been operating in a gray area for years, using vague language to intimidate homeowners and push their own agenda. But what made it worse was the way they targeted certain properties, mostly those owned by longtime residents or folks who had pushed back in the past. Power plays disguised as code enforcement. One afternoon, I sat with Clara and laid out what I'd found. "This isn't just about us," I said. "It's systemic." Clara frowned. "So what do we do? Take on the whole HOA?" "We start by holding them accountable. I'm drafting a formal complaint with the city and the state regulatory board that oversees homeowners associations. If they want to keep running this community, they have to play by the rules." She reached out and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you." That same week, Ronald called me again, this time with a different tone. "Chief, I hear you're stirring up trouble," he said, a hint of frustration creeping in. "I'm making sure everyone's rights are protected," I said firmly. "If that's trouble, then so be it." "You're making enemies," he warned. "I'm just making sure the law is respected." Despite his threats, I pressed on, attending city council meetings and speaking with affected homeowners. I started organizing a community group to provide support and advice to residents facing unfair fines and restrictions. Word spread fast. People who had felt powerless began to speak up. One evening, I received a letter slipped under my gate, anonymous but clear. "Stop meddling in HOA affairs, Chief. You don't belong here." I smiled quietly. They didn't know who they were dealing with, because I wasn't just a rancher fighting for my property. I was the law, and I was ready to prove it. By the time I walked into the next HOA board meeting, wearing my police uniform, the room had already reached a boiling point. I could feel the tension as soon as I pushed the door open. This wasn't just another gathering of community members. This was the moment things were about to get real. The board members, including Ronald Spears, were seated around a long conference table, their usual confident airs replaced by nervous glances. They had received official notice from the city and my department that an investigation was underway. The county sheriff's office was also involved, thanks to the pressure we'd built. I had requested this meeting to discuss the ongoing complaints and ensure the HOA understood the legal boundaries they were crossing. As I entered, the room fell silent. "Good evening," I began, my voice calm but authoritative. "I'm here as police chief of this town to remind you that while homeowners associations have the right to enforce certain community standards, those rights are limited by state and local laws. What you've been doing goes beyond those limits." Ronald tried to interject. "This is a private organization." "Private or not," I cut in. "You don't get to break the law. You don't get to harass homeowners or seal off private property. You don't get to act like you're above the law." I laid out the evidence we had gathered, documentation of improper fines, lack of due process, unauthorized property interference, and explained the legal consequences if the HOA failed to comply. The room was quiet, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One board member whispered to Ronald, "Maybe we should listen." I could see the gears turning behind their eyes. The realization was sinking in. This wasn't a game anymore. "I want to work with you," I said, "to establish clear guidelines that protect homeowners and respect the HOA's role. But everything must be transparent and lawful." After an hour of tough questions and debates, the board reluctantly agreed to appoint a legal consultant and cooperate fully with the investigations. They also promised to suspend enforcement actions pending the review. When I left the meeting, a few neighbors shook my hand. "Thank you for standing up for us," said one elderly woman. "It's about time someone did," added a young father. Driving back to the ranch, I felt a mix of relief and resolve. The uniform wasn't just fabric or a badge, it was a symbol of accountability. And tonight it had spoken louder than words. The weeks following the boardroom showdown were a whirlwind. The HOA, now under official scrutiny, began making slow but visible changes. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't perfect, but progress was finally underway. I spent countless hours coordinating with city officials, the county sheriff's office, and state regulators. Our combined pressure forced the HOA to revise its bylaws and enforcement procedures. Most importantly, they were required to notify residents properly before taking any action, and to respect property owners' rights fully. But beyond policy changes, the real victory was in the community. Homeowners started speaking openly about their experiences, about fines they had paid unfairly, about fear of retaliation, and about feeling powerless. We formed a neighborhood committee to give residents a voice, and I helped organize workshops on understanding property rights and HOA regulations. Clara and I hosted one such session at our ranch. Seeing neighbors come together, sharing their stories and supporting one another was inspiring. "People don't realize how much power they actually have," Clara said one evening as we watched the sun set over the fields. "They just need to know how to use it," I replied. The experience also taught me a lot as police chief. Enforcing the law isn't always about crime scenes or arrests. It's about protecting everyday citizens from abuses of power, no matter how small or seemingly bureaucratic. One afternoon, Ronald Spears reached out. His tone was humble. "Chief, I want to thank you for your patience and professionalism. The board is committed to making things right." I accepted the gesture. "Let's keep it that way." The sealed gate incident that started all this felt like a distant memory. Yet, its ripples had changed the entire community. And me. I realized that sometimes the best way to protect your own property and your own peace of mind is to stand firm, speak up, and make sure the law is more than just words on paper. Because in the end, that law protects all of us. Months had passed since the gate incident, but the effects were still being felt throughout Silver Creek Estates. The neighborhood, once divided and wary, was slowly coming together in ways I hadn't imagined possible. After the HOA's bylaws were overhauled and enforcement policies rewritten, the community saw a noticeable change. Residents were finally being treated fairly, and their voices were respected, not dismissed. The neighborhood committee we formed had become a powerful platform for discussion and decision-making. I watched as homeowners took turns leading meetings, organizing neighborhood cleanups, and even planning community events. People who had been strangers before were now neighbors, working together. One afternoon, Clara and I hosted a barbecue at the ranch. The turnout was incredible. Families, couples, and even a few HOA board members showed up. There was laughter, shared stories, and a genuine sense of camaraderie. I raised a glass and said, "To a community that stands up for each other, respects the law, and works together, here's to Silver Creek Estates, stronger than ever." The crowd cheered. Through this journey, I'd learned something important. Authority isn't about power or control. It's about responsibility. Whether you're the police chief or a homeowner, it's about caring for your community and protecting each other's rights. The gate that was once sealed off was now just a regular entrance, unlocked and welcoming. And as I stood there, surrounded by friends and neighbors, I realized that sometimes the greatest battles lead to the strongest bonds. Silver Creek Estates was no longer a place divided by rules and resentment. It was a community united by respect, trust, and the shared understanding that the law protects us all. And that, more than anything else, made it a home.